Hello and welcome back to this PHP beginners course. So the aim of this session is to build a basic multi-user PHP login system. Sounds a little bit heavy, but we can achieve this by using only around about 70 lines of code. So we're going to cover in this session variables, HTTP post, session, control statements, and we're going to have a little look at the MySQL database, create a very simple database, add some data. That's going to be the username and password of the user. So this is what we're going to be building in this PHP login session. You can see that we've got a form here. We type in our name and our password. We press submit. There we go. We go to the admin section. It says you are now logged in and I can log out. So if I type in something incorrectly, you can see that I'm just sent back to the index page. Now, I can also go to the admin.php page. Notice that I'm not logged in, so I can't access the page. So this is what we're now going to build. Okay, so let's start the project. So the first thing we need to do is start our server. So if I go into the C drive and then XAMPP, if you're using XAMPP, the control panel, and then mine's already started, so I'm just going to start the database too. So that's the first thing that I need to get sorted. Right, so if you remember the htdocs folder, that's where all the files are going to be stored. So I'm going to open up my code editor and then file open folder. I want to open the folder where the root directory is of my server. htdocs, so select that folder, and now I'm working within that folder. So let's just create a new file. I'll call that index.php. There's not going to be any PHP on this, but we're just going to call that .php. And then just say A, just to make sure that it's working. I go back to my server, I refresh, and there we go. So we're definitely working in the right space. So the first thing we need to do is head over to Bootstrap. So if you head over to Bootstrap, go to documentation, and then down here in the introduction section, we've got this starter template. That's where we're going to start. That saves us a little bit of time doing that. We get rid of the H1 tag. We're going to call it PHP login. There we go. Zoom in a little bit for you. And here we are. We're ready to start. So I've gone ahead and I've created the first part of this project. So save you having to look at me type code. I'm just now going to explain what's happening here. So we've got these outer element here, class container, class TextLight, and class MT5. So these are all Bootstrap classes. So because we've incorporated Bootstrap into this project, we're able to use the CSS that's already predefined for us. And that makes our programming or our development a lot quicker because I'm not having to write out CSS. So here we're building a container, which is going to be a center container around about 1,170 pixels in width. And then we've got text light. So I'm defining that all the text in here is going to be light. This could be text dark or light. So because I've got a dark background, I want the text to be light. And then I'm using a margin top, MT5. So I just want to make a container in the middle of the page with a margin at the top of around about 5. And then I've got a new element here with class row. And I'm going to justify the content, everything inside of here. All these child divs are going to be centered to this element here. So that's justified content center. And then I've got a new div here with column 5. So that's the width of the column. If I change that to 1, that's going to be really small. And if I change that to 12, the maximum, that's going to be a really large column in width. And then I've got background dark. So that's going to change the background color to dark. And then I've got a padding of 3 around. So if you remember the CSS box model, I'm using padding all the way around of 3. So inside of that, I then have a new column of 4. Actually, I don't need that. So inside of that, I've now got a heading PHP login. So that's where we start off. So if we go ahead and view that, there we go. That's what we've got. So what we obviously need now is a form. That's what we need to do next. So inside of our element here, underneath the heading, I've added a new form. So form tags, we're going to have an action called process. So this form, when it submits, when you press submit, it's going to go to this page called process.php. And there's going to be some PHP on there that's going to process all the data and try and log you into the system. And we're going to be utilizing the method post. So I'm not going to be explaining that, except for this is a method of sending data from this page over to the next PHP page. And inside of here, we now have our Bootstrap class form group. So every element in our form is going to be wrapped in this element class form group. So first thing we need to do is let's just build a new input. So with Bootstrap, we have a label and an input. So first of all, we make a label and then we create the input. So here, for example, if you can see, we've got a label. Now I've given this name 4. So that's bound to the ID of the input. So notice that it's highlighted. So this name here, example input email, is the same as this ID here. So it's bound, and I'll explain that in a second. And you can see inside it says email address. That's the label. Next, you need an input. Type email. That's the type of data that's going to be stored or entered into this form. Input. We've got name, email. That's important because that's the information that's going to be sent across to the next PHP page, the name. And then the class, that's just a Bootstrap class, form control. And then ID. And then we've got some other information, including a placeholder, which is going to say enter email. So by default, the input field is going to have a text inside of it called enter email. So underneath, I've just created some text there, and it just says, we'll never share your email with anyone else. So it's just some text in a small tag, set of tags there. Okay, so that's our first label. You type that in, and I save that. There we go. That's our first entry. So the reason why we use 4 and then bind it to the ID of the input, if I click on email address, you can see how this cursor appears here. So that's why we have in the input, in the label, 4. So this is bound to the ID of the input. So when we click on that name, it then puts the cursor in the input. Okay, so that's the first input. Okay, so then the second input, we need a password. So we're going to enter the email address and the password in order to enter this system. So if we just have a look at that, we've then got a new form group, class form group. We then have a label. Again, this is just a label that's going to match the ID of the input. And then we have inside of this password. So that's the label. And then the input type is going to be password for the input, and then name password. Class form control from Bootstrap. ID is going to match the 4 in the label. And then the placeholder, the text that's going to be in the input by default is going to say password. So let's just see that in action. And there we go. So there we have our PHP login page ready to go, our form. So obviously now we're going to need a submit button. So here it is, a button. So we're using the button element tag, type submit. Class, again, these are all Bootstrap classes. So this creates the button, and then this will define the color of the button. So this is just going to style the button, and then it's just going to say submit. Okay, so let's just update that by saving it and pressing refresh. And now we have a submit button. So if I press submit, if you remember, we're sending this information that someone types in to the page called process.php. And we're using the vehicle post, in this case, the tool post, in order to send that data across. So if I press refresh and then press submit, you can see we get an error because we don't actually have the page process.php yet. But you can see that we got some functionality in place. So I guess now what we need to do is head over to the process.php page and build that. Right, so let's build the process.php page. So a new file again, process.php, and here we are. So let's just remember first off that we need to set out the PHP delimiters and define PHP within these delimiters. So let's just imagine someone's typed in their email and their password into that form, and what we need to send across is the data that they entered. So the data that they entered was email and password. And that's defined by, if we go back here, that is defined or is referenced by the name. In this case, email, and then the password input was referenced as password. So if you like, these are going to be set up as variables. So what's going to be stored in this variable is the email that someone's typed in, and what's going to be stored in this password variable is the password that someone's typed in. And that's going to be sent across to this page called process.php via the post vehicle. So that data gets sent across. And then when we go back into this process page, we now need to capture the information that someone's typed into the input to that form. So we can do that by doing this. So in order to make a variable in PHP, we use the dollar and then the name of the variable. And then we want that to equal post, $_post, and then email. So whatever's stored in the email information is going to now be stored in this variable called email. Whatever's stored in this password variable is now going to be stored in this variable we now created called pwd. So all we're doing is passing the information from the form over to these new variables, and we're using the post vehicle to do that. So hopefully that makes sense. Notice that email and password, like I said, matches the name of the input fields, the input name, and then the input name here, password. Okay. Okay, so now we're going to build a database to store some information, the email and password, so we can retrieve it from the database and check to see if the user is able to log in or not. Right, so we just need to make sure that XAMPP is running the MySQL. Yep, so that's the database. So now I need to go to the browser, and in order to access my database server, I'm going to be using the PHPMyAdmin software that's pre-installed with the XAMPP software. So you're going to need to type in the name of your server or the address of your server, then /, and then PHPMyAdmin. Okay, so that's going to take you to the PHPMyAdmin. So from here, we need to make a new database. So there's already a database made here called test. If I can zoom in. In order to delete a database, I double click on the database icon and then go down and drop the database, press OK, the database disappears. So in order to make a database, I press new, and then I name it. In this case, I'm going to name it login, and I press create. So I've created a database. So there's nothing inside of this database at the moment, so I need to add some tables and some fields. So let's create a new table. So let's think about how many tables I'm going to need. Well, I'm just going to need one table, and that's going to be called password, or users, actually. And then how many columns do I need? Well, I need 2 columns, because one for email address and one for password. So I press go, and that's now going to take me to this step here. So what I need to do now is define my fields. So I need an email field, and I need a password field. And then I need to think about what type of data I want to store in here. So not to complicate things at this point, I'm just going to choose varchar. And now I need to select the length. So I'm just going to put in 100 in both. So I'm not going to go through these specific details. This is just the length of information that we can store. And this varchar means that we can store numbers and letters. So that's what I've set up. And now once I've done that, I can press save at the bottom right-hand corner. There we go. So that's a really simple database setup. So now I have a database, I need to be able to connect my PHP to the database. So first of all, I set up the database configuration. So I need to know the server name, which is localhost or 127.0.0.1. That's our IP address. Remember, our local IP address to reference our own development machine. I need a username. So by default, the program that we're using does have a username and password. It just happens to be the username is root. So I type in root. So that's why we type in root there. And by default, there isn't a password. So we don't need to type in anything there. So that's just the default username and password. And then the database name, if you go back to your PHPMyAdmin, you can see my database name is called login. So therefore, I've changed the database name to login. Okay, so now I have the configuration. I need to be able to create a connection. So I'll create a new variable here called con, and that equals, we're going to be utilizing MySQL. And then we need to connect to that, and we need some parameters in order to connect to the database. So the parameters that we need are these parameters here that we've already set up. So we take the server name, the username, the password, and the database name, and we pass that into this function here, this MySQL connect function, and that would then help create the connection. Now there is a statement here underneath that just captures if there is a problem with the connection. So we're going to receive a reply from the software, and we're going to capture that reply from the software if it doesn't work, this connection, and therefore we have a better idea what the problem is if there is a problem connecting to the database. Okay, so now what we need to do is we need to pass some instructions over to the database. We need to ask it a question. So if you're not familiar with SQL, I'll give you a brief overview of what this statement is doing for us, or what it's saying, or how it can be interpreted. So we've set up a new variable here called SQL. So this is the instruction that we want to send to the database so that we can retrieve information from the database. So this is how we communicate with the database software. So we say select all. So we're going to select all the data from the table users. So that's what we want to do, because what we want to do, if you imagine someone's typed in their username or their email, and their password, what we want to do now is check the database to see if that username and email exists in the database. So we want to check the whole database. That's why we select from all. We select, all from the database. So we select, or we look through the whole database, and what we're looking for is where the email in the database, so this is referencing the, if we go back to the database, this email here is referencing this row here, so this element here. So look inside of there, and we're looking for where something equals email. And this is the variable, if I go back here, this is the variable that we set up initially, where we captured where someone's typed in their email. So what we're doing here is we're checking to see if the email that someone's typed in actually exists in the database. And then we do the same thing again for the password. So we've got an and. So select from users where email equals email and password equals PWD. So remember again at the top here, we captured where someone's typed in their password into this variable. And now we're using that variable to enter information here to build this string so that we can send across this SQL statement to the database. So far we've sent a message to the database selecting some data. Now there's two things that are going to happen. One, the database can't find an email and password that matches what someone's typed in. That's instance one. Or instance two is obviously the scenario where an email and password does match the database and therefore gets returned. So the database is going to tell us or send us a message back, and it's going to tell us whether it's found information or not, whether the record exists or not, whether the email and password in the database exists or not. So now we've got everything ready. We prepared everything we need. We now create a result. So we run MySQL query, and what that needs is the connection information. So we build the connection and then we run the SQL. So that will then return the result from the database and store it in this variable here called result. So let's test this to see if it's working. So what we're going to do now is set up an if statement. So we're going to count the number of rows that returned. So for example, in this case, there's only ever going to be one row returned because we're just looking for an email and password in the database that matches the email and password that someone's typed in. Now, theoretically, no two users will have the same email and password. So, like I said, if a match is made, the maximum amount of things or items or rows that are going to be returned is just one. So if, for example, the rows that gets returned from the result is more than 0, so 1, then we're going to echo out found user. Now, if the results returned are 0, so it didn't find a match of the email and password, then we're going to return, we're going to echo out, for example, not found. Okay, so we're just going to do that for now so we can see on our system. So we've got that in place now. So let's just go back to our PHP login page. So we're just going to type in something random and press submit. Now, because we've defined this form to be an email address, HTML5 here is telling us, well, this needs to be an actual email. So I have to actually type in an email form, a@a.com, and then press submit. And you can see here that there's an error on line 23. So let's go to line 23, if else. I suppose I should use a semicolon to end the statements. So let's try that. We continue, and there we go, not found. So let's just go back to the home page and try that again. So email address and then password, submit, not found. So you can see that we haven't found a result. So let's now go into the database and add a new entry to see if we can get it to say found user. So heading back into PHPMyAdmin, we now are going to add a new user into the system. So I select login, that's my database, and then users. From here, I select insert. Right, so email and password. So the email is going to be a@a.com and a@a.com. Yep. And then the password is just going to be test for now. And then I press go. Okay, so now I've added some information. It's successful into the database. If I go back to browse now, you can see that I now have an email and password in the database. There we go. There we go. So that's now entered in the database. So let's go back to our system and refresh the page. No, we don't need to do that. Sorry. Let's just go back to our home page. Let's type in a@a.com. So that definitely is in our database now. And then the password is test. So what we should see now is found user. So you can now see we've got the basic functionality of a login system. So now we need some way of being able to go to different pages and being able to be identified as someone who is actually logged in. Because at the moment, all we've done is we've got a username and password, and we've identified that there is a username and password in the database. That's all we've done now. But now we need the actual process, or think of some way, or have some way of being able to identify the fact that a user is logged in, and therefore they're now allowed to go to the admin page, for example. So in order to do that, PHP has a tool called sessions. So a session is basically a variable that gets installed or gets created on the server. And then what we have on the host machine is a cookie with a key, for example. And that key is connected or is referenced to that session, that variable that's on the server. Now, there is some security here because this key is obviously a very unique, very long key, and only you have that key. And only you then are able to access that variable that's stored on the server. So what we need to do now is we need to set or create a session create that variable on the server to identify the users logged in. And that session is permanent for a duration, which means that this user can traverse or navigate the website and go to multiple pages and be recognized as someone who is actually logged into the system. So back into our code, we just need to remove now these echoes that we created, because that was just for our reference to show that it was working. So in order to work with a session, the first thing we need to do is to create a session. So we do that within the if statement, because remember, we've checked to see if someone is actually matching their email and password. So if they do match, we're going to log them into the session here. So first of all, we're going to need session start. So that's going to initiate a session so that we can add some data to the session. So once we've created a session, we now can create some data for the session. So we create a variable. In this case, I'm going to call it check user. And then that should equal something. So for example, I'm just going to make that call, say, login. Okay, so we're creating a new session variable called check user, and that's going to equal login. So if someone has matched their email and password, it means that a new session is started. They're going to receive a session cookie, for example, and that's going to have a key. And that key is going to be able to access this variable that's stored on the server. So now what I want to do, now I've set up that variable, and they're logged in, or their credentials have been checked on the database, and now I've set up a session. Now I'm going to send them to the admin page. So now what I'm going to build is a new page called admin.php, and only people that have logged in are going to be able to access this, which means that I need to check on the admin page whether a user has a session active. So let's do that next. So I've just changed the header location. So this header, I don't think I explained this. This is a redirect. So when this gets processed, it comes down to here, it creates the variable, the session variable, and it gets to this line, and then we create a new header. So what that means is that the user is going to be redirected to this page here called admin. So we now make a new page called admin, and then inside of here, the first thing we need to do, you might have guessed it, is to start a session. So if we want session data, we need to start a session. So we do that, and then now we're creating an if statement again. So if the session variable called check user is equal to login, so it will do, because remember we're creating a session here called check user equals login. So that will be stored in the server and be referenced from the host machine, the user's machine. So if the session variable called check user equals login, then you are now logged in. Now, if a user hasn't logged in successfully, then they're going to be then sent across back to the index page. So this is what's going to protect the page. This is the nuts and bolts of our login system. Okay, so let's just get rid of that for now. So let's just zoom out a little bit so you can see what's going on here. So we start a session. We then we have an if else statement. So if there is an active session, we're going to say you are now logged in, and then else you're going to be sent back to the index page. So that's what's happening now. Okay, so we don't need that for now. There we go. Okay, so let's see this in action. If we now go back to the home page, let's log in successfully. And we're being processed, but you see that nothing is happening. Okay, so then I realized I haven't typed in the password correctly. So we're going to try that again. So test and aa.com, submit. No, and now we're not working. So aa.com, and then password is going to be test. And this time I got it correct. And you can now see it says you are now logged in. So in order for us now to log out, we just need to destroy the session. So this session is active on your machine and the server. So if we want to log out, all we need to do is delete this variable, delete this session, remove or stop the session. So in order to do that, we're going to build a logout page. So let's build a new logout page. It's going to be called logout.php. Could be called sign out. So in here, what we're going to need to do is obviously start the session, and then we need to destroy it. Okay, so we have session start again, and then we destroy the session. So session underscore destroy. So what happens after that? We then use the header again, because we're then going to send the user back to the index page. So let's see that in action now. So what we're going to need to do in the admin page is create a new link to the logout page .php. So just call that logout. There we go. So if we go back now into our system and then go back to the home page, we're going to enter our details, type in password correctly, hopefully. Yep. And now we've got the option to log out. So if I log out, I'm then taken back to the login system. So remember that I'm logged out now. So let's just try and force our way now into the admin page, see what happens. So if I type in admin.php, you can see that we're just taken back to the index page. So we're protecting our admin page from this session facility. So we have to actually match a username and password or an email and password in order to get to the admin page. Hence, now we have a login system. So if we go back and log in, if I were to now just go back to here, and remember I am logged in, if I go now to manually type in admin.php, I'm allowed in because I have a session and I started a session. So if I log out again, there we go, we now got a logout. So just to tidy up the process page, we've added an else at the end of this if. So if at the moment it just said if someone had logged in, it was greater than 0, then they were taken to the admin page. And I've included an else. So if they aren't logged in or if their details aren't correct, then it just takes them back to the index page. Okay, so there we have a very basic, simple PHP login system using sessions. Okay, so there we have it. Again, we built a basic multi-user PHP login system. Obviously, you could add new users to that if you wanted to. We've used variables. We've used HTTP post to send information from a page to another page. We've used sessions so that we can navigate or traverse our website logged in. We've used control statements, if-else statements, and we've looked briefly at the MySQL database.